Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Eva Krukowska, and I'll have the honor to moderate our next panel, a very interesting one, on disruptions to transatlantic energy security and competitiveness. As we meet, both the US and Europe are seeking to diversify their energy sources and boost their competitiveness. The EU wants to turn away from its reliance on Russian gas imports. The US wants to strengthen its global energy partnerships. And at the same time, it's reshaping global trade rules with tariffs. Geopolitical tensions threaten supply chains, and China, in the meanwhile, is strengthening its role in clean energy, already a dominant one. How can the EU and US cooperate in those uncertain times? That is exactly what we will discuss with my two distinguished panelists. European Commission Dan Jørgensen, Commissioner for Energy, whom I warmly invite to the podium, and Mr. Wally Adeyemo, Distinguished Fellow, Institute of Global Politics and Center on Global Energy Policy, and a former Deputy State Treasury. Dan, my first question goes to you. Energy transition, not an easy one.
No.
It's not just a climate strategy, it's also a pillar of energy security in Europe.
Sure.
Energy prices are off their all-time highs that we saw in the middle of the crisis linked to Russian invasion in Ukraine, but they are still a burden, a worry for many companies in the middle of the energy transition. As you look to build new energy partnerships, what regions are on top of mind, and what principles are guiding your choices?
So, I think in the US, when a president assumes office, he swears at the Bible, right? Okay, I'll share a secret with you. What happens when you become commissioner is that you are taken to President Ursula von der Leyen's office, and then you swear on the Draghi report. Now, for those of you who don't know, Draghi published a report in which he gives a pretty bleak analysis of the competitiveness of the European Union, but he also offers answers, and he mentions energy more than 700 times. He does that for a reason, because we pay 2 or 3 times more for our energy in Europe than does our competitors in the US and China, just to give you an example. Our strategy is of course complex, but at the same time it's pretty clear and simple. We need to move away from being dependent on importing fossil energy from other countries, especially if that other country is an enemy, as Russia is. And we have come far in that respect. In 2022, we got 51% of our coal from Russia. Now we get 0. We got 27% of our oil from Russia. Now we get 3. We got 45% of our gas. Now 13. But I just recently presented a roadmap on how we will get 100% rid of this gas. Of course, part of this strategy is to move away from gas altogether. So fast deployment of more renewables, fast deployment of new energy efficiency tools. But it's also about diversifying who we then get our energy from. And here, especially the 2 countries have been extremely helpful, Norway and the US. Others also, but Norway and the US is now number 1 and 2 countries on the planet that we import our fossil energy from. So that is the most basic answer. Obviously then there's all of the details about how to then make that happen. It's just not easy to transition your economy away from fossils into renewables, of course, even though it's cheaper and it provides you with more security.
Well, a question to you, because you played a central role in implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, the object of envy when it was announced in Europe. Some people were saying that basically Europe is offering a stick, you are offering carrots. But now the current administration is seeking to roll back at least some of the provisions. We also have the risk of a tariff war. There is also the issue of the strength or weakness of dollar. What were your lessons learned during your time at the Treasury, and how do you see the situation now?
Well, let me start by saying how good it is to be back in Europe. This is my first trip here since ending my time as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And I'll say what I would have said when I was here then, which is that incentives matter. And ultimately, getting the incentives right when it comes to the clean energy transition is critical to ensuring that we get there as quickly as possible. And for us, it wasn't only about climate change, it was also about energy security over time. Although we are a net energy exporter, we know that the price of that energy is not set by the United States, especially when it came to the most important fossil fuel to us, the gas that was put in someone's gas tank or oil. What we did with the Inflation Reduction Act was create incentives for businesses to make investments in the clean energy transition we needed to do, and it worked tremendously well, so well that a number of European companies started to invest in the United States, which for many of my friends in Europe caused a great deal of concern. But from our standpoint, we weren't attempting to outcompete Europe. We were attempting to be in a place where we could meet not only America's needs, but global need for clean energy. And that's why we were excited to see Europe take a number of the same steps when it came to creating those incentives. The challenge that Congress faces now is that if Republicans do what the House passed, it won't only slow our ability to meet the climate challenge, but it's going to increase the cost of energy for American households. That will mean that if you're an American trying to heat your home, trying to power your house, the price of energy is likely to go up if what they do to the Inflation Reduction Act happens. And part of that is because we've brought down the cost of capital, but a huge piece of this for the United States is the fact that energy demand has outstripped capacity in the medium term because of things like AI, the data centers that are being created. And what this tells me, and what I think is important for all of us to realize, is that in order to have a dynamic economy, you have to have ample supply of energy to meet the needs of not just industry, but also of your people. And that's why what the commissioner is talking about matters so much here in Europe. Despite what people hear, the most important partner for the United States over the long term is Europe. Unless Europe's economy is competitive, there is no way that we can stand together and meet the challenges of the 21st century. That's why in the Obama administration we spent so much time trying to get, and we have our ambassador from Germany here, he was in many of these meetings, trying to convince Germany that being reliant on Russia for gas was dangerous for you. And I think the message today is that while you're moving away from reliance on Russia from gas, being reliant on China for critical minerals is another risk. If you are overly reliant on any one supplier in the world we live in today, you take a real risk with your energy security.
Let me turn back to you, Dan. Climate plans, we're talking about the need to have reliable energy sources, also clean energy sources in Europe. The Commission is about to propose, possibly next month, a new target, 40% for 2040, 90% emission reduction versus 1990 levels. Still, with China strengthening its grip on clean tech and the US leaning on its hydrocarbons advantage, with transatlantic tensions over tariffs, where exactly do you see the room for EU-US cooperation?
Well, many things to unwrap in what you just said. One is, yes, it's true. China has gained leadership in some areas of clean tech. I don't think we should complain about that. When I started my political career, I was also engaged in the fight against climate change, and there our number one priority was to get China on board. Now they're finally on board. By the way, I can say also, we also argued many years, how will we get the US on board? And then all of a sudden, when you adopted the IRA, which was fantastic, and I congratulate you on that, some of the same companies who's been putting pressure on us policymakers to put pressure on the US were now complaining. The US is doing too good. But that is the paradoxes of politics, I guess. For us, we really need to have our own strategy, independent of what will be the decisions made in Washington or Beijing. I think this is something that we've learned within the last 6 months if we didn't know it on beforehand. And that then brings me back to also our overall strategy, because whether or not you think our security of supply is the most important, or you think our competitiveness is the most important, or you think fighting climate change for the sake of future generation is the most important, the basic answer will be the same for us. It'll be to move away from a dependency in which we import for more than 300 billion in average a year fossil energy from other parts of the world, and instead produce our own energy. That doesn't come without challenges either. I acknowledge that. Rare minerals is a very good example of that. But those challenges can be solved, and it's actually also one of the areas where I very much hope that we can work together across the Atlantic.
Working cross-Atlantic will probably have to mean at some point more imports of US LNG while Europe turns away from Russia.
Yes, well, we certainly need to diversify even more. I will say that we already brought our consumption down so much that it's not huge amounts that we will need. Also because every year we bring down our consumption of gas in Europe with 15 BCM. And in 1 year we import 36 BCM from Russia. So it's not huge amounts, but yes, we will need to import, probably also a little bit more than we do now. And yes, US is obviously an important partner there. I went to CERAWeek in Houston a couple of months back, and spoke to many American companies that were more than ready to help us there. I think it's of mutual benefit.
US LNG imports, trade, sanctions, this is all part of the same story, sort of at least. Europe is not going to rely on sanctions when it turns away from Russian energy imports, simply because sanctions need unanimity. But question to you, Wally, you were also responsible for sanctions on Russia when you were in the US administration. They do weaken Russia's work capacity, but they need strong enforcement to be effective. What are your lessons from this time?
I think the most important lesson I learned from helping to lead the effort on Russian sanctions was of the importance of working with other countries.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have been anywhere near as effective with regard to our sanctions but for the partnership with Europe. Full stop. Ultimately, Russia did far more business with Europe than they did with the United States, and the Kremlin anticipated that Europe would be the weak link. They assumed wrongly. Europe has acted strongly and stood up to Russia at every single turn. They were our partner in each and everything that we did. And while sometimes we had to go left instead of right, ultimately, strategically, we were fully aligned. And I think that was a critical piece of being able to constrain Russia's economy. And while we face challenges both in Europe and in the United States with regard to our economy, we want it to grow faster, we want to provide better for our people. Inflation in Russia last month was at 10%. The Russian economy is in tatters. The key now is whether we are going to be able to hold Russia accountable for what they've done in Ukraine. And the key to that is going to be this transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States. And I think we can't be naive about the fact that it has changed in the last several months. And fundamentally, we should not assume that we're going to get to a place where these trade discussions are going to lead to some positive outcome that's going to be long-lasting. There are going to be conflicts in this relationship. But ultimately, leadership, I think the thing the commissioner said that's important is that Europe needs to have its own strategy. Yeah. And I think that strategy has to be built on the idea that Europe needs to grow its economy in a way that will be productive going forward. Pulling away from the IRA for the United States is a strategic misstep, for example. When you think about the way that investments are being made in the United States and the fact that the people who are most in favor of the IRA today are big companies, it speaks to why what we were doing made sense, and it speaks to why Europe's focus on competitiveness is not just an economic issue, it's also a strategic issue. So ultimately, for Russia, even if they're in a position where they feel confident about their ability to potentially get a deal with the current U.S. administration, they recognize that even with a deal with the United States, they're not going to get a deal with Europe. They're still going to face these sanctions. They're still going to be in a place where they have concerns with their ability of their economy to operate because of European unity. So a big thing that I learned in being one of the people who was the point people for sanctions was the importance of multilateral action. And the key now, as Europe considers its path forward, is what is Europe's strategy and how does it work with partners to develop that strategy going forward?
Talking about partners and sanctions, only yesterday, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the proposal for the next big sanctions package on Russia. It covers part of the Russian energy sector. The proposal was to sanction Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, but also to lower the price cap on Russian oil, part of the G7 initiative. The proposal is to lower the cap to $45 per barrel from $60 per barrel. That is where the market is currently. Do you think that you will be able to get support from the rest of G7 then?
First of all, I certainly hope so. I want to just also add to that a couple of things. One is our focus on the Russian shadow fleet, which is extremely important in this regard. And second, when I spoke about the roadmap earlier, I understand that a roadmap might not seem like such a hardcore tool to use when we are speaking about sanctions, but actually what we're proposing to do is something that's even stronger than sanctions. We are banning Russian gas. So from the 1st of January, we'll be banning spot market LNG, and from the end of 27, we'll be banning also long-term contracts. So all gas from Russia. So a ban is not something that has to be renewed every 6 months. It's not something that demands unanimity. It's something that can be passed by a majority in Europe, and it stands until somebody changes the legislation, which is a very difficult process in the EU. So this will stand also after a peace agreement, which is, I think, a very important signal, and also, by the way, a strategic choice.
You say that it's basically the end of Russian energy imports to Europe with the ban. But in the US, we are hearing some reports, speculation that some American investors are interested in Nord Stream 1, perhaps in Nord Stream 2. Do you think it would be possible for American investors to proceed with such plans? And what role could they play?
No, and I think the reason for that is because of Europe's resolve. Ultimately, this was another place where John and I spent a great deal of time talking to our German counterparts about, but today we're in a place where Europe is unified with regard to the fact that they both need to cut off Russia's ability to hold them at risk. But I think the more important piece is that they are willing to take steps to constrain Russia's ability to earn revenue from selling energy anywhere in the world.
Exactly.
One of the thing that I hope that they consider is taking additional steps to go after choke points that Russia has. For example, Russian ships have to pass through things like the Danish Straits on a regular basis. How are you making sure that those Russian ships have adequate insurance that is meeting the price cap? How do you take other steps to increase the frictions on Russia's ability to earn revenue is going to be critical, but I know that there have been a great deal of talk about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 and whether the U.S. would be interested in engaging there in some ways. My view is that that is not going to happen, largely because of Europe's resolve, which I think has surprised the world in terms of Europe's willingness to do the hard things in order to stand up for their values. And as long as Europe is willing to do that, my view is that Russia is going to remain constrained despite what the United States may want to do. I think the key here, though, comes back to the point I continue to make, which is that competitiveness is going to be the key, because asking European companies and individuals to continue to bear a cost for Russia's violation of international law is something that they're willing to do, but they do want to see over the medium term that they're going to be able to compete in the global economy. And I think the plan that the Commission has laid out will allow them to do it. The question isn't one of capacity, it's about the will to implement, and I'm heartened to hear what the Commissioner is saying, but the key comes down to execution.
Can I also just add a small anecdote to that? I was Minister of Energy in Denmark in February 22, and we spent the first couple of weeks after the full-scale invasion making emergency plans for which companies to close down by force if Putin turned off the taps. I mean, we would have sent men in uniform to close companies in order for us to have gas enough for our hospitals and our homes. This is not a good situation to be in for any country, and Denmark, by the way, was not as exposed as many other European countries. So it goes both ways. It's a threat to us because we don't want to pay money and thereby help fill up the war chest of Kremlin. This is a paradox, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but we've spent more money buying Russian gas since February 22 than we've given in aid to Ukraine. This obviously will not stand, but it's also about not being dependent on somebody who can then weaponize energy against us. And this is why, and thank you for your kind words about our resolve, but I think that's the explanation for that resolve.
The expectation is that the Commission will propose the actual measures to phase out Russian energy still this month, maybe in a week from now. What impact do you think they will have on energy prices?
So we expect that we can do this without it leading to higher energy prices because we've prepared well. And we've gone from, as I said, 45% of our gas being Russian down to 13%. And the way we will do it now is to then say, okay, gradually towards the end of 27, we will then phase out the last. And if we look at how much new LNG will be on the market and how much will reduce our own use of gas and how much we've managed to diversify, this can be done. I want to, of course, underline that I'm not neglecting the worries of the few countries that are opposing this because they worry about their own populations. I wish that they will change their mind and support us in this ban, but it's possible to both wish for them to change their mind and still acknowledge that they need to take care of their populations, and we will from the European Commission side, of course, help as much as we can solve the problems that in especially 2 member states that there can arise on the short term, but it is something that is possible to solve.
Thank you. We still have 8 minutes, and I would love to take a couple of questions from the floor. We've got the first question, if we have the microphone, in the first row. Could you please introduce yourself and say whom you address your question to, please?
Thank you. My name is Daniel Lor. I was the former Minister for Economic Growth and Innovation of Bulgaria, a country where South Stream does pass. First of all, a big thank you to the Commission for the 18th package that has just passed. My question is, do we understand you correctly that as of next year, Russian LNG will be banned, and as of 2027, Russian pipe gas will be banned, both from the north and from the south, which is critical to achieving the full independence of Russian resources that we seek? Thank you.
Yes, so I need to start by saying that this is the proposal of the Commission and it needs to be adopted by Member States and the Parliament, of course. Otherwise, I'll get in troubles. But the reason I feel confident is because it's been very well received, both by Member States and by the Parliament. And yes, we start with addressing spot market contracts on LNG, and that's probably around one fourth to 1/3 of the Russian gas that's being bought right now. And then at the end of 27, it will be all gas. And a part of the legislative package that I will put forward very, very soon will also include the obligation of member states to put forward a plan on how this phase out will happen. This is, of course, something we do so that we can see that the countries are actually doing what they need to do, but it's also to be seen as a help to the countries, because we do acknowledge that some might need help diversifying their imports, and we stand ready to do that, also to speak to other partners, well, both internally in Europe, of course, but also Azerbaijan, Northern Africa, Qatar and others.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. I'm Heather Gravey from Bruegel, economics think tank here in Brussels. I want to ask about the renewable energy transition in the United States. So the big difference between importing oil and gas as commodities or using them or producing renewables is once you've done the capital investment, then the operating costs are much lower. Now that's critical for Europe because otherwise we have to spend a lot of money on the imports. But it's also very important for the political economy in the US, where of course the installed renewable capacity is running and it can compete with fossil fuels. But we see a lot of attempts to make that no longer work, in fact, to set the incentives in the other direction. How far do you think those will succeed, for example, in Texas?
My view is that we're going to continue to see more renewables come onto the grid in the United States because of the laws of physics and the fact that we are in a position where energy demand outstrips, in the medium term, energy supply. And one of the most interesting things about the IRA debate right now is the people who are vocal critics of what was done in the House of Representatives are the big technology companies in the United States, because many of them are reliant on clean energy solutions to help power their data centers. And what the IRA does is it buys down their cost of capital. In addition to them, it's the utilities that are big critics of what the House has done, because they are currently making huge investments in infrastructure throughout the country, including in places like Texas, and those costs are being brought down by using the IRA incentives. And for those utilities, if they don't have the IRA incentives to bring down the cost of infrastructure, they're still going to invest in the infrastructure, but they're going to pass on those costs to consumers in each one of those states. And for a local official, the last thing you want is for the person who's getting that energy bill to realize that because their congressman or their senator voted for a bill, now your energy bill is going higher because of it. So my view is that while the IRA is going to be changed, and it's clear that Republicans are going to change things like the EV tax credit, you're going to be in a place where you're going to see more renewables. But another place where I do think you're seeing a bipartisan consensus form is on nuclear, where in the United States, my expectation is you're going to see Republicans potentially increase the incentives that are put into nuclear, which from my standpoint is a good thing. Ultimately, I don't think there's a way that we meet the climate crisis without doing much more nuclear in the United States. And frankly, I think you're going to have to do more nuclear in Europe as well in order to meet the climate crisis, largely because it is a sustainable way to continue to provide, to your point, energy going forward. I think the place where the debate is going to be the fiercest is on things like hydrogen, where it's a technology that isn't proven, but if you want to produce steel, you need something that's going to be able to be used for something like that going forward. My sense right now is that we're in a place where the number of things that we disagree about across the transatlantic relationship is greater than it's been in generations. But a place where I think there needs to be agreement is on the idea that we need access to the key minerals, to the rare earths that are going to help power our economies going forward. And we can't be overly dependent on one supplier or any one country. My hope is that this is a place where Europe will develop a strategy and bring along allies and partners, including the Australians, the Canadians. Even if the United States doesn't join, this is going to be critical to the ability of the West to survive, because at the moment we are overly dependent on one supplier for critical minerals and for rare earths, and that creates the same kind of dependency challenges that Europe had with Russia.
I very much agree with that, and I also hope that that is an area where indeed we can work together across the Atlantic. It seems like almost unsolvable challenge right now. But actually, if you look into the numbers and you look into the possible sources and you look into the investments needed, it is not impossible, especially not if we work together. So I will definitely hope that that is one of the areas. I will also say actually on new nuclear technology like small modular reactors, that's also an area where hopefully we can work together. I've been tasked by President von der Leyen on making a strategy for the deployment of those types of reactors in Europe. We haven't got them yet. They are underway, I think, some places in the US and some places in Asia, and hopefully also in Europe sooner or later. But there are also, both the US and the EU is facing the challenge that a lot of the nuclear fuel that's out there on the world market today comes from Russia.
Yeah.
And that is also part of our strategy to become independent of that. So also there we need to find other sources and work together.
And I think I am probably less hopeful than some in the room on the idea that we're going to find some kind of magical trade agreement by July 9th, just given the laws of physics and having spent a bunch of time talking about TTIP with my friends in Europe. But I do think that in some of these more strategic areas that are going to matter, that are both economic and strategic, there is hope, because ultimately the United States under this administration is clearly going to try and do it alone. But the thing that I learned, and I think they're going to learn as well, is there is no way to do it alone and meet the scale and breadth of what China has done. You're going to need to do it with friends and allies. And there is no better friend or ally to the United States over time than Europe. They have the economic scale and the ability to partner with us to help build up those supply chains that we're going to need for these things. It may take some time, but I don't think there's another way to actually meet the needs that our citizens have.
I echo that.
Thank you so much. It was a great discussion, much appreciated. Thank you.